So we're going to continue sort of a church and state kind of a thing by reading chapter 24 of a book by Peter Brown called Through the Eye of the Needle, which I started to reference when I started All Things Bruno. In case you don't know, Giordano Bruno was a heretic put to death by the Catholic Church in 1600 for suggesting everything we're learning about quantum physics right now, which is that there's potentially parallel universes that interact with each other and that are completely without a human conception to understand. You can see it even on TikTok. There's things coming out, very, very recent research suggesting that two electrons across the universe can talk to each other. It's all Bruno stuff. Now, I picked Bruno as sort of a spoof on Cardano, which was not a spin-off, but just go with it. The former CEO of the Ethereum Foundation left and created Cardano, and I had a picture of Bruno on my iPad, and I said, I'd make a great meme and logo for a crypto influencing campaign. So we're going to do this book by Peter Brown. This is the book of What's Your Roman Empire? A lot of people talk about the fall of Rome, and they want to see like the big bloody stuff. And I guess my comment there would be Rome was really good at the big bloody stuff. Like nobody was bad. I just watched Spartacus. It's probably the best Roman movie you can see. And Gladiators. A lot about Gladiators really good too. The opening scene for Gladiator, the original one, is a really good depiction of just the total military they didn't have gunpowder and stuff. But you look at it, and it looks like the Americans, it looks like the Americans versus pretty much everybody else. But you look at it, and it looks like the Americans, it looks like the Americans versus pretty much everybody else. And so forth, better discipline. They got their ass kicked every once in a while. I think they lost to the Carthaginians 3 times. Like they lost like 200,000 troops and then came back. The third time, the fucking Carthaginians are just like, these people are crazy. No, that was in Sicily. I think it was the Carthaginians. All right, so back to the subject of the day. Everybody knows the famous sack of Rome. And it was done because of an Epstein problem. Seriously, it was done because of sex trafficking in mass. Like 20,000 German hostages. Kids. It's like right out of an Epstein thing. And the people up north were just like, you have to understand that, and you're going to get it in this chapter whenever I shut up and start to read, that there wasn't like this big line and like the Germans were, the Goths were up here and the Romans are here. No. The whole history of Rome is this interweaving of all these people together. But one question you could ask yourself is, who are the barbarians today? I won't answer that because that's an interesting question. I'll give you a hint. A lot of them serve in the U.S. military. I mean barbarians in quotes. I don't really mean barbarians in a derogatory way. I mean, who are the people on the other side of the river? Okay. So I'm going to try to do this with limited interruption. So I'm going to read the last page of chapter 23 and it'll set it up for you. The hat is irony, people. The hat is irony. Yeah, I'm calling your attention. By the way, I love the logo, right? The logo says it all. All the stuff that I've talked about on here is just perfectly represented by this logo. But yeah, if you want to read an account of the, it's in the first opening chapters of City of God by St. Augustine. Is all about the sack of Rome. And it was like the world stood on its head. Like how could the gods ever allow this to happen, right? That's Augustine's takeoff point. So here we go. Last page 384, chapter 23. But at the time, the shortfall of Christian influence in crucial matters such as taxation and sanctuary was accepted as the price the churches were prepared to pay for enjoying the overall protection and privileges provided by a seemingly solid empire. However, this situation would not last forever. The 5th century would prove to be a time of unpleasant surprises, the most unpleasant of which was the realization that the empire itself was far from solid. Starting around 405-406, the weakness of the empire was revealed ever more clearly decade by decade. Within a few decades, even Africa was involved in a common disaster. In the very last year of Augustine's life, 429, a Vandal army suddenly appeared before the walls of Hippo, which is a city in Africa, North Africa. I think it's Tunisia. Having crossed the Straits of Gibraltar and swept unopposed and largely unobserved for 900 miles through the western North Africa. A decade later, in 439, 9 years after the death of Augustine, the unthinkable happened. Carthage fell to the Vandals. In the words of Quad Voltus, boy, that's quite a handle. Quad Voltus, the successor of Aurelius as bishop of Carthage, it was the end of an age. Where is Africa? Which was the whole world a garden of delights, meaning when it was under the control of the Romans. It is time to turn away from Africa and to consider the crisis of empire that had already engulfed the provinces of the northern Mediterranean. In order to do this, we must return to Gaul around the year 400. So it's chapter 24, quote, still at that time a more affluent empire, the crisis of the West in the 5th century. If you're just joining us, this is What's Your Roman Empire? Subtitle, The Iron and Clay, Civil War and the Barbarian Invasions, 405-39. This chapter will deal with the general crisis of the Western Empire throughout the 5th century AD. It will describe the onset of the crisis that had reduced the empire within a generation to a shell of its former self. It will then linger on the adjustments the wealthy of the provinces most affected by this crisis were forced to make and the opportunities many of them seized in an increasingly regionalized world. Decentralization. It will end by pointing to the survival of the empire in some of these regions and to the loyalty it could still inspire in many figures before the empire itself vanished from the West, leaving some of the most vocal supporters in fragmented world deprived for the first time in a half a millennium of an imperial core. Sort of a Mark 11. The chapters that follow this one will be devoted less to the end of the empire than to the age of Latin Christianity. They will introduce the reader to the landscapes that remained in imperial hands throughout most of the 5th century. They will describe the brilliant and controversial circles associated with Marseille and the island of Lorenz in Provence, the fiery tracks of Salvian, who I think was a Christian thinker, of Marseille, the Rome of the Senate and the popes, and the countryside of the southern Italy. The last two chapters, 28 of this book, will view the West as a whole in an age without empire. They will sketch the emergence of a new Christianity. The first of these two chapters will describe the manner in which the Christian churches became aware of their own great wealth and the steps they took to protect and display it. The last chapter will survey the Latin Christian world of the 6th century. It will trace the manner in which the weight of wealth in the hands of the new donors of a post-imperial age caused Christianity itself to take on a new and sharper profile, very different from the religion we first met 2 centuries before in the hesitant days of 350, when Christians were underground. But now let us turn to the beginning of the crisis from which all this derived. We must do so by returning to Gaul, it's France, in the middle of the 4th century. A traveler from the east, who is probably a Syrian, wrote of Gaul, it is a very great province, and for that reason always needs to have an emperor present. It produces an emperor of its own. This seemingly naive description was doubly accurate. A strong emperor was needed in Gaul in order to keep watch over the Rhine from Trier. When such an emperor was lacking, the local armies instantly proclaimed a usurper so as to fill the threatening vacuum of power. Just an aside, France is really the first barbarian kingdom. The France that replaced Gaul is still called France, by the way, and it means the Franks. The absence of an emperor was a signal for usurpation and civil war. This had already happened twice in the first part of the 4th century. By contrast, the reign of Valentinian at Trier from 364 to 375 had been a moment of peace and prosperity. The steady flow of goods and taxes to Trier fostered the affluence of the villa owners of southern Britain, Gaul, and Spain, known to us through archaeology and through the works of Ausonius, whom we met in chapter 12. After the death of Valentinian, Gaul began to feel again the chill of imperial absence. The center of gravity of the Roman world swung south and east, towards northern Italy, the Balkans, and Constantinople. Once again, emperors were proclaimed in Gaul. Each was committed to defending his title by engaging in an empire-wide civil war. Twice in 6 years, emperors from Gaul found themselves forced to strip the garrisons of Britain and the Rhine in order to wage war in Italy. This is a civil war. These troops were fed into the meat grinder of major battles with fellow Romans. The eastern armies of Emperor Theodosius, only a skeleton force of professional troops remained along the northwestern frontiers of the empire. The provincials held their breath. One such principal was Severus, whom we have met as a friend of Paulinus, the author of Life of St. Martin. It is around 400 he finished a world chronicle in the quiet of his villa in Primulaicum, between Toulouse and Narbonne. He viewed his times with alarm. He wrote that the Roman Empire was, quote, once the strongest of all empires, but now it was the weakest. Like the great statue in the Book of David, it was an empire with feet of clay. It was doomed to disintegration. Quote, this is again from this guy who wrote The Life of St. Martin. For it is not ruled by any one single emperor, but by many emperors, who are always divided by military confrontations and by conflicts of basic interests. While the soil of the Roman Empire has been occupied by foreign and rebellious nations, in such a way that barbarian tribes have come to be mixed up with us, like fissile clay inserted into the iron of a Roman order, in our armies, in our cities, and throughout our provinces. In 405, Sculpius was proved right. Civil war mixed with the, quote, clay of ill-absorbed barbarians who were used in lieu of regular troops by contending Roman emperors created the perfect storm. It raged for a generation throughout Britain, Gaul, Spain, and Africa. Sulpicius, I think it's Sulpicius, or Sulpicius, himself survived, but he and those like him emerged to find themselves in a world from which their leisured way of life, the product of strong rule and aggressive fiscal system, had vanished for good. The story of this perfect storm can be told briefly. On December 31, 405, a large confederacy of barbarian groups, Vandals, Sueves, where we get the word Swiss, and Alans, drawn originally from the Middle Danube with little previous contact with Roman populations, crossed the Rhine near Mainz. They came to plunder and, for all we know, to seek employment. The armies of Britain created an emperor to deal with them, Constantine III. Constantine pinned the barbarians down in northern Gaul. His main concern, however, was to establish himself as the rightful emperor in the west. In 407, he moved quickly south, as the Emperor Maximus had done for the same reason 20 years earlier. So, it might be the Maximus that we know from the movie. So as to invade Italy. In the next year, the murderous confederacy from across the Rhine appeared in Aquitaine, the richest region in Gaul, already known to us as the homeland of Ausonius, Paulinus, and Sulpicius, I'll say Severus. A tsunami of violence swept over southern Gaul. The barbarians had found their way into the very bowels of the Roman Empire. And even in our knowledge to this day, like rich people and movie stars and shit go to the south of France because it's so beautiful. And right, this is what we're talking about. But the barbarians had not fought their way to the south. They were there because Constantine III needed them. He had discreetly reallocated them from the northern to southern Gaul so as to use their violence in this civil war. Like any other desperate army at the time of civil war, Roman troops included, they were paid for their services by license to plunder. It was a Roman who brought them in. No, we're not going to say anything about ice right now. We're going to continue the good book. In October 409, the same groups crossed the passes of the Pyrenees into Spain. Again, they had not moved on their own accord. They had been invited by yet another usurper now set up in Saragossa. Vandals, Alans, and Sueves fanned out across the wide spaces of the Iberian Spanish peninsula. They looted the countryside and shook down cities. Their depredations are usually referred to somewhat dramatically as, quote, the barbarian invasions. There was no such thing. There, if you've stayed this long, you just learned something that nobody knows. Dramatically as the barbarian invasions, there was no such thing. They were collateral damage brought upon the provinces by contending emperors. The vagaries of civil war and not any headlong momentum of invasion on their part accounted for the movements of barbarian groups at this time. Many, quote, barbarians were little more than freelance pillagers and highwaymen, such as always appeared in Roman provinces in times of disorder. They were like gangs of slave traders who had raided the mountain districts around Hippo in the same years. Outside Tarragona, for example, one band of barbarians robbed a priest of the case of books that he was carrying and then took them to the nearest town to see if he could find a purchaser, to see if they could find a purchaser. These random gangs were troublesome, but they were hardly the bloodthirsty cavalcades that we imagine when we speak of barbarian invasions. Archaeological surveys of the area around Tarragona show that throughout this period of upheaval, the countryside remained populous and productive. They're like cartels. This period of upheaval, the countryside remained populous and productive. They're like cartels. A few years. They allied themselves with this, quote, legitimate emperor of Ravenna, which is, I think, where Charlemagne was crowned emperor, 350 years later. Moving into Spain, the superior numbers enabled them to wipe out most of the Alans and an entire sub-tribe of the Vandals. In 418, they were rewarded by being settled in Aquitaine. This was, in many ways, a state-sponsored land grab. Direct access to landed estates, and perhaps some scholars speculate to tax revenues, was the most acceptable form of all the license to pillage that had been extended by rival emperors to the other barbarian militias in lieu of pay. The settlement of the Visigoths in Aquitaine was their bonus for having participated on the right side in a decade of civil war. A state of imminent civil war was provided the background to the most extraordinary exploit of all in this time. In 429, the Vandals of King Genseric crossed from southern Spain into North Africa. This was the last years of Augustine's life. Boniface, the Count of Africa, the commander of the only Roman forces in the province, had been a correspondent of Augustine's. In 429, he was engaged in a confrontation with rivals across the sea in Italy. With his back turned on the hinterland of Africa, he was again taken totally by surprise by the Vandals suddenly emerged from the west. Again in September 439, Genseric took Carthage at a time when the relief of the city had been held back because of divisions at the court of Ravenna. Although in its civil war and no bloodthirsty drive of their own, they had moved barbarian militias from one end of the Roman west to the other in under a generation. The loss of Africa marked the end of an era. Civil war waged right? The big thing, the big war for Rome was always with Carthage. So to have Carthage lost was sort of like the beginning of the end. The loss of Africa marked the end of an era. Civil war waged by novel means, that is, through the use of barbarian militias, had destabilized the provinces of Britain, Spain, and Gaul. But the Vandal conquest of Carthage did more than this. It broke the tax spine of the Western Empire. In the words of Jill Harries, the battle for Gaul, and one might add Britain and Spain, had been lost in Africa. They lost the tax revenue. Already in 430, articulate contemporaries knew that they lived in a generation that had seen the end of the Belle Epoque, beautiful age, when in 431 the Emperor Valentinian chose to please the Senate of Rome by honoring a Roman worthy of the age, Symmachus, the great pagan. Nimachus Flavianus, who had died in 394, there was an element of nostalgia trip about this venture. The long inscription that had placed on the base of the statue of Flavianus in the Forum of Trajan emphasized the manner in which he had used his high offices to preserve and increase, quote, the wealth of what was still at the time a more affluent empire, unquote. By 411, the tax revenues of the empire had probably dropped by 50%. After the loss of Carthage, they dropped further. The Republica was left with a quarter of the resources it had enjoyed under the Emperor Valentinian. The empire had suffered a dramatic loss of revenue. More serious still, what had been crippled was the motor force of hard government from on top, which had enabled wealth accumulated through the taxes to be turned into seemingly unchallengeable social hierarchies by the wealthy in the glory days of the 4th century age of gold. The great machine that had made the rich so very rich had stalled. Factionalism and impoverishment, the case of Paulinus of Pella, 376-459. It is easy to describe the stages of this debacle than it is to say what exactly had happened to West Roman society in these crucial 30 years. Here the sources do not help us. When they looked back from mid-century, vocal Roman writers tended to blame everything on the barbarians. In 452, a chronicler wrote in the Mediterranean city of Marseille, that after 405, the madness of hostile peoples tore all Gaul to pieces. Given the inherited prejudices of all educated Romans against barbarians, and given the behavior of the armed bands, who had been granted license to pillage the civilian population by warring Roman emperors, this melodramatic view is not surprising. It had always proved easy to string together a series of blood-curdling quotations from contemporary authors who described the hardships suffered by the Roman population at the time. But this catalog of woes is essentially superficial. It does not in itself explain the profound changes in Roman provincial society that were set around the 410s and had become irreversible over much of the West by 450. What we call the barbarian invasions are better seen as jets of water that suddenly announced the breaking of a dam. The real collapse of the dam came from within. The clay of barbarian military groups established on Roman territory acted as the catalyst for an abrupt reshuffling of social hierarchies among the Roman themselves. We are dealing with a social edifice which, once its glory days, had been capable of changing at a touch. It is the edifice and not the barbarians who touched it, and that deserves our attention. First of all, we should never underestimate the factionalism of the Roman provincial elites when they call them oligarchs, by the way. The Roman provincial elites when faced with a situation of civil war. When civil war was mixed with the dangerous clay of barbarian bands, the local elites were far from being content to remain the passive victims of barbarian violence. They pitched in with gusto to despoil each other. We can see this in the case of the author of an autobiographical poem, Paulinus of Pella. He was the grandson of none other than Ausonius of Bordeaux, had been born at Pella in northern Greece in 376, where his father had held a governmental post that had been secured for him by Ausonius in the heyday of the influence of the court of Trier in 370. Paulinus was a quote empire brat. As a baby, he had been in Carthage, where his father was proconsul. He had passed through Rome. On his return to, he's like one of the Trump kids. Sorry, I'll keep my comments limited. He inherited a palace to set work improving his wife's properties in Aquitaine. This all happened before 405. Paulinus, it's either Paulinus or Paulinus, looked back at those days of old world peace with calculated nostalgia. Seldom do we see so clearly an author creating for himself the gilded image of an ancient regime. In those happy days he had hunted with his father, he had begotten children with his slaves. Never, he assures us, he had raped a woman, nor he had accepted the favors of freeborn girl. In describing his lifestyle at that time, Paulinus made his own cramping coyness of his grandfather Ausonius. Quote, "This was what suited my status as one who looked for moderate satisfactions, delightful but far removed from self-display. A house equipped with spacious rooms, each suited to different season of the year, a rich and attractive table, many servants, and young men at that, silver plate distinguished for its refinement, not for its mere mass, workmen skilled in various crafts to meet my commissions, stables filled with well-conditioned beasts and coaches to carry me around safely and in style. But I was less concerned to expand these things than to preserve them. I was not excessively anxious to increase my revenue, nor to seek out high office." And at this time, we can all stop and go look at the lifestyle of Joel, what's the guy's name from Houston? The preacher? I almost said Epstein. But Paulinus, as for so many other Roman provincials, the villa's owner ideal of a restrained life on the land, uninvolved in politics, was somewhat of a pose. The moment the chance imperial office came his way, Paulinus, like the old Ausonius at the court of Trier, jumped in. He found an emperor on his doorstep. The emperor Attalus had been set up in 414 by the Visigoths in southern France. Paulinus rallied to Attalus, who made him count of the sacred largesses. This post involved Paulinus in an ugly business of handling the properties of prescribed persons. In times of civil war, business was more than usually brisk in that department. And so the barbarian raids really happened internally. Like, you getting the joke here? I used to have this teacher in prep school. He'd be talking and writing, and then he'd turn around, "You getting all this? You getting all this?" Unfortunately, Attalus was no Valentinian I. He was bankrupt. Short of pay, angry Visigoths burned his palace in Bordeaux. Paulinus wrote so vividly of the burning that a reader might be expected to believe that all of Bordeaux, that all of Bordeaux had been set on fire. That all of Bordeaux had been set on fire by the barbarians, but this was not the case. We are not dealing with widespread destruction. Rather, Paulinus described was thoroughly Roman event, the torching of the house of an unpopular official. The house of Symmachus's father suffered the same fate in Rome 40 years previously. In the long run, Paulinus's luck ran out. He ended his life as a poor man, partly dependent on the charity of the Church of Marseille. His plot of only 4 in Ingera, perched on the rocks outside of Marseille, even when it was with a townhouse and supplemented by ingenious rental arrangements, compared badly with the 1,050 of his father Ausonius's little inheritance outside Bazas, whatever that, Bazas. But if Paulinus was impoverished, it was not because of the passing of the barbarians through the Aquitaine. It was because of the factional violence among Romans themselves in civil strife. In 399, his namesake Paulinus of Nola, not New Orleans, had almost lost his own life and property in a similar situation when he was caught in the backlash of the civil war that followed the usurpation of Maximus. a civil war that had always been a time of massive confiscations and for the settling of scores between local notables. In the studious, bland language of the imperial law passed in 416, Paulinus of Pella's progressive expropriation had just been one of those things that happened improperly and spitefully in times of civil strife. This is the next 10 paragraphs I've referenced many times making Bruno content because I think they tell the story of where the Western world is right now better than anything else. Local Romanness versus Central Romanness. Two soldiers were unalived or in the capital from West Virginia recently. I don't mean to smile because of that event, but the weirdness of all this is hard to ignore. Local Romanness against Central Romanness. West Virginia has its own problems. They shouldn't be sending the National Guard to Washington, D.C. Paulinus' account of his career is so vivid that we can forget when it was written and for what purposes. It took the form of a poem titled Thanksgiving to God the old man wrote at a formidable age of 84 in 459. It was written to thank God for having enabled him to establish good relations with the court of the Gothic king now established in his former home city of Bordeaux. Paulinus' sons had previously returned to Bordeaux, quote, both were fired with the desire for freedom, which they thought they could find in greater measure at Bordeaux, albeit in collaboration with the settled Goths. It's snowing outside and the sun just came out. One of Paulinus' sons was no more successful as a politician than his father had been. The Gothic court was not an easy place. Quote, tossed between the good friendship and the anger of the king, unquote, he had been as thoroughly despoiled as his father had been. But this was not done by the Goths. It was done by his fellow Romans. Yet it had not been for lack of trying. Romans quickly learned that they could make their fortunes at barbarian courts in the 5th century, if on a smaller scale, much as they had done at the court of emperors in the 4th century. For we know of many who have flourished through the favor of the Goths, unquote. Ultimately, it was the development of barbarian courts, such as the Gothic court first at Bordeaux and then in Toulouse, to which enterprising young Romans might turn, and not the colorful rampages of the first decade of the barbarian invasions that sealed the fate of the imperial order of the West. What needs to be explained, therefore, is the relative ease with which already by the late 450s, local barbarian strongmen, such as the Goths at Bordeaux, had come to use their armies to create alternative power structures to those of the empire. It is the digging in of the barbarians and not their first imagined henlog progress through the bowels of the empire that poses the real problem to the historians of the Roman West in this last century. With remarkable speed, local power blocks appeared. In each royal court emerged as the center of patronage and government. Not all of these power blocks were set up by barbarians. Some were ruled by self-consciously, quote, Roman figures, such as emerged in northern Gaul and perhaps among the competing tribal regions in Britain. But they were all disturbingly isomorphic on a smaller scale to the res publica of the legitimate Roman Empire. It was the creation of these alternatives to empire that changed the rules of the game by which the wealthy became wealthy in a new age. To me, that's the whole thing right there, right? What's your Roman Empire? All you need is that sentence. How did this happen? The answer lies perhaps in the strong regionalism of the provinces of Gaul, France, and Spain, even more so of Britain, where pre-Roman tribal identities may have reemerged. It's funny, like even in this day and age, we have a really profound that there's like these countries called England, Spain, and France, right? It still exists today. Local nobilities had always drawn their wealth from these relatively small catchment areas. Their ambitions were tended to center on the province alone. This regionalism reached back to the very beginning of the empire. The Roman Empire in the West had always been a federation of regions. The appearance of the barbarians dislocated the mechanisms by which this federation had been held together for many centuries. In the words of Guy Halsall, I'm sure some historian, the key factor in the breakup of the empire was the exposure of a critical fault line between the imperial government and the interests of the regional elites. In many ways, the 4th century age of gold had been unusual. An active imperial court had created a service aristocracy that was more fluid and more tied to the imperial center than had been previously the case. As we saw, the world of Ausonius was not a world of self-contained owners of latifundia plantations who were able to sit out periods of civil disorder. It was a world of courtiers and courtiers. I should know that. Even on the wide plateau of Spain, the basis of wealth of those who owned the great villas of the 4th century came from their implication in a network of imperial tax collection. An aristocracy created, to the greater extent than ever previously in Roman history, by close involvement with state power, was bound to change when this state power changed, when it weakened, when it withdrew, and above all, was replaced by other, more local power blocks. What the relatively small armies of the Goths, Swiss, and Vandals, and later the Franks and Burgundians, offered to the regional elites was what the sons of Paulinus sought at the Gothic court of Bordeaux, a return to wealth through the service at a center of state power. But this time it was a local center. In effect, barbarian kings and their armed retinues offered the regional elites a Rome at home. That's a pretty good line. That's maybe what I'll call this, Rome at home. These little Romes were largely run by local Romans. They drew to themselves courtiers and litigants from the region. They proved more accessible as a source of justice and wealth than was the increasingly impoverished res publica, the legitimate empire that now ruled Rome from a distance across the Alps in Ravenna and Rome. We are dealing with a powerful reversal of the mechanism set in place in the West under Constantine and his successors. In the 4th century, the presence of an imperial court in the West had enabled the wealthy to partake in an ever wider pyramids of influence. They held office throughout the empire. They owned land in many provinces. In the 5th century, the emergence of local courts worked in the opposite direction. In many parts of Gaul, Spain, and Africa, late Roman society was miniaturized. Regional elites dug themselves in around local centers of military power. They did so in a world whose horizons had shrunk and where the opportunities for widespread enrichment, even in the service of an active barbarian king, had, with very few exceptions, closed down to the level of a single region. Reviewing the history of the 5th century West, Peter Heather has described the process of the fall of the Roman Empire in terms similar to those of Halsall, another historian. The end of the empire was the story of, quote, destruction of Central Romanness. But what replaced this, quote, Central Romanness was not barbarism, but forms of local Romanness, a social order that had grown from the ground up as the Roman regional elites opted for local leaders, local armies, and local systems of patronage, all of which were offered by barbarian kings and their followers. And that's enough for one sitting. This is mainly to be put for free on Substack. Tell friends and relatives. I'll finish this weekend. I'll probably finish this chapter. 8 or 10 pages. I'll do another one. But I wanted to get that. You almost have to listen to the whole thing to really hear. He completely upends your 20th century Fox view of the barbarian invasions, just these waves of the scary people you see at the beginning of the movie Gladiator. Those scary people were brought in a lot like the cartels today. So I'll see you on Substack. Have a nice weekend. Happy Black Friday.